Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print media and cinema. So, we are talking about displaced people and abandoned homes today. This is an example that I had cited right at the beginning of this lecture series, which tells us why partition is still a relevant topic of discussion and the apparitions of partition have not gone away. They keep looming large on the future of South Asia and South Asian politics. We see Anjali Geraroy and Nandi Bhatia observes that in May 2005, there was a report of potential eviction of partition refugees from Rajpura, Punjab, from their temporary government allotted accommodation called Kasturba Seva Ashram, which caused panic among the refugees who had nowhere else to go. And this caught the attention of local news, but did not catch national attention. It kind of remained unheard, and the cause of eviction was cited as unsafe constructions. However, one could very well assume that the price of this land in Rajpura had considerably appreciated over the years and they needed to be claimed by the government. So, we see the unofficial history, the parallel history of partition, which in a way goes unnoticed in the larger schema of national happenings, and yet these histories keep unfolding. They are still taking place as late as 2005. So, P.O. Oberoi says that those persons forced to leave their homes during the partition were seen as refugees because of the failure on the part of the state mechanisms to protect the rights of these displaced persons. Shuchi Kothari and Rita Kothari study the question of nostalgia and how this question or how the nostalgic renderings or nostalgic accounts change from one refugee to the other. So, record from their interviews discover or observe that for the wealthy business class people, the nostalgia is not presented in the same way, or the nostalgic accounts are not the same as for the middle class or the lower middle class. The business class people can afford to make unsentimental admission, for example, about not going back to their homeland, because they are assimilated with the fabric of India in a successful manner, in an organized fashion. So, one's class position becomes very important in the treatment of memory and nostalgic renditions. Similarly, in the case of Bengal, Anusha Boshurai Chaudhary notes how memory is used as a means of cutting off from the East Bengali past in the case of some refugees. So, he interviews this one Noni Gopal Babu, who says in clear terms that our Desh has changed. For Noni Gopal, this purposeful withdrawal could be seen as also disowning one's former self in a way, as well as the geopolitical belonging, the geopolitical kind of connection with the homeland, because the native land had failed to sustain an individual like him as well as his family members. So, these kinds of nostalgic remembrances do not support the imagination of the idyllic that we see in the most prominent accounts. So, these remembrances cannot be integrated alongside the sublime imagination of an idyllic Desh. So, for some, memory of Desh harbingers embittered memories of riots, and so they have a different relation with the past, different way of connecting with the past. Pipavadi looks at the south and eastern side of Lyalpur city, where the government college and the Khalsa college had been turned into refugee camps. 60,000 people had gathered at Khalsa college to seek temporary refuge before their departure towards India. Arya High School was also used as a camp where almost 40,000 people were housed, and the refugees squatted in classrooms, in verandas, as well as in the playgrounds. It was a kind of unusual situation, a chaotic situation, widespread chaos prevailed. Temporary refugee camps such as the Khalsa College was invested with diseases like cholera and dysentery in the absence of sanitized conditions, and additionally the refugees were prone to attacks by looters and rapists. So, the process of migration, the process of journeying from one country to the other, from one new post-colonial nation to the other, was fraught with many difficulties, many resistances. It was not the same for the affluent sections, but for the ordinary people it was not an easy journey to make. So, convoy of refugees crossed more than 100 miles on foot along with their livestock. Most people would walk, they brought their carts and used their tongas for transporting goods, and the sick and elderly would travel along with these people. So, this is the general picture of kafila that I mean we have in our mind when we talk of exchange of populations. The popular imagination that has stayed, or this popular image that has stayed with us when we talk of partition, when we talk of population exchanged as a result of the partition. So, Indian troops guarded the refugees, and sense of normality would prevail in the form of breaks taken to cook, milk the cows, especially for the infants and the infirms, and so people would try to keep up their morale, keep up their spirit through occasional speeches by the leaders and playing some music. So, people would try to frolic and try to uplift their spirit even amid such dismal situations. So, the Indian government assisted the refugees by dropping food and drugs by air. Vaccines and doctors were flown in to assist the sick. The field ambulances were sent to vaccinate the refugees before crossing the border, and then the infirm refugees would be taken. So, the field ambulances were sent to vaccinate the refugees before crossing the border, following which the refugees would be taken to the reception camps. Pakistan government many a times caused resistance and disturbances in the form of blocking certain routes such as the Balochi route. These routes would be indiscriminately closed, making the process of migration further challenging, further difficult for the Hindu and Sikh migrants moving from Lalpur, West Pakistan to the eastern side. So, the migrants were forced to adopt a kind of fixed identity due to the structure of the camp in which they were initially put. Their identities would be shaped by their daily aggressions and frictions that prevailed among them. And this is also something that Ravinder Kaur says, once a person becomes a part of this otherwise extremely heterogeneous term refugee, which could have a range of meanings, once, or even the ordinary acts of an individual such as eating, resting, tending a child would become a part of that popular picture of the partition refugee. So, the mundane human acts were seen as acts of the refugee. They became a caste in their own right suddenly. They were no longer, they became ahistorical figures, some people that were detached from snapped, people whose past was snapped. So, while giving due cognizance to the overarching circumstances that conditioned their lives, it is nonetheless equally important to pay heed to the refugees' perceptions of themselves, how the refugees saw themselves and other members from the community. And so, we see when the perceptions come from the person who experienced these conditions, these hardships, the point of view contradicts the fixed identity about the refugee, the fixed stock category of refugee or the social marker of refugee that have been assigned to them, something that the refugee has to bear on his identity, has to carry, regardless of his or her choice, because they are historical victims, victims of certain circumstance. Since the time a person is displaced from ancestral homes on the other side of the border, everything that they do, they see and they say becomes part of the refugee discourse and the refugee's point of view, the refugee's experience. So, we need to also look at and understand the layers that exist within this discourse. So, despite the subjective nature of memory studies, memories can serve as a rich repository of displaced people's experiences. So, according to the government rehabilitation, the term refugee refers to a person who has been uprooted from his or her desh, and so the government of West Bengal defines a refugee as a person who migrated into West Bengal for reasons of safety. The legal definition of a refugee, on the other hand, refers to a person who is forced to flee his place of origin because he or she is scared of persecution for his or her way of life or the faith that he or she practices in the native land. This is how the refugee is defined by the UN Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol, as well as the 1969 convention and the Cartagena Declaration of 1984. As India was not a signatory of any of the international refugee protection regime, the officials of the Government of India and West Bengal preferred the term displaced rather than refugee when it came to the issue of rehabilitation and resettlement. Yashodhara Bagchi and Shubharanjan Dasgupta note that while the partition of Punjab was a one-time event with mayhem and forced migration restricted primarily to 3 years, the partition of Bengal has turned out to be a continuing process. This inexorable constant carved in our memories has always served to remind us of the horrendous past, right. So, a displaced person is one that has entered India and left, or someone that was compelled to leave his home in East Pakistan on or after 15th of October 1947 for disturbances or fear of disturbances, or on account of setting up of the two dominions of India and Pakistan. So, this is the definition that we get from the Government of India. Hindus that had fled East Pakistan before 15th of October were not included in this official definition. So, we have already discussed how this is an ironical situation where a definition that that involves temporal brackets tends to leave out a certain populace who were similar victims, who were similarly victimized. Just because various definitions involve temporal brackets, so a person who was equally or more violated, but before this mentioned time bracket does not get to become a displaced person enough, cannot claim to be a displaced person. The passport system had to be implemented, and the refugees were considered an exceptional case because till a point they possessed citizenship rights in both the nation states. So, after the independence on 15th of August 1947, the citizens were given 2 more months to settle in the country of their choice. So, the displaced people were eventually called migrants, and they were separated into 2 groups, the old migrants and the new migrants. Hindus that were displaced by the newly formed East Pakistan were forced to seek refuge in the Indian federal states of West Bengal, Assam and Tripura. And so, the population problem in these 3 states have remained persistent since the 1940s decades, because infiltration kept happening in waves against the backdrop of different communal riots, disturbances, infiltrations, migrations kept happening, refugees kept trickling through and across the porous border, and so the population problem has persistently remained in these states such as West Bengal, Assam and Tripura. So, educated Hindus could avail new opportunities of livelihood, and so they were settled in the new land in a comparatively shorter period of time, and had a reduced experience of agony in a certain way. So, the displaced people among the Bengalis would arrive at the Shialda station, Calcutta's reception and interception centers as the cross border influx continued in the second half of the 1940s and early 1950s. The government only realized the need of creating pre-planned provisions in the early 1950s and not before that. Several transit camps were subsequently established in West Bengal's neighboring districts as a way of providing temporary aid to the refugees. And for the Bengali refugees, the dilemma was further, the dilemma was furthermore, the situation was furthermore complicated. Some Dalit refugees especially write that they would not get rented houses. The landlords would apprehend that these tenants would go back to East Pakistan without paying the rents, because they were seen as temporary evacuees. So, houses would not be given out to them for on rent, and they would face, they could not get hold of a land where they could build their own shops or small businesses, for the same reason that they might flee in a few days time without paying the company. So, these people, it was very difficult for the native population to trust these people, the migrants that they saw as temporary residents in West Bengal. So, as there was a time gap between preparing for partition and preparing to face the consequences of this partition, the government had treated uh, the, the government had treated the initial period as a passing phase, and so it was largely seen both by the center and the West Bengal state government as a temporary condition, where after things settled, a lot of the Bengali Dalit refugees especially would go back to East Pakistan and claim their lands and their homes there. So the Dalits were facing a different kind of disadvantage, where the question of trust would be there. I mean, they had to answer people. They were all of a sudden more accountable in different ways. So categories of identity such as evacuees, refugees, displaced persons, aliens, infiltrators were used as a major filtering process for establishing post partition national orders and for turning colonial subjects into national citizens through these grids. And these identities were produced discursively, mediated through the actions of officials that were located at the borders and associated with diplomatic missions. So, in another lecture we will discuss how recent artworks on partition, such as Shunanda Shikdar's work, the Muir Kotha, recounts the problematic or the difficult process of crossing the border, where awkward questions would be asked even to young children coming from East Pakistan, right. So, there was a tension ridden, or there was a tension fraught dialogue that one had to go through at the border level, and through one's interface with diplomats. So, refugee documents, border slips, passports were means used through which were the means through which the Indian state sought to differentiate the refugees from the migrants, from the aliens, and all of them from the citizens. So, legislations surrounding the rights to own and transfer property was closely tied with the question of negotiating one's nationality and national belonging. So, implicit within these redefinitions, these categories, such as who is a fugitive, who is a refugee, who is an alien, who is an infiltrator or even a spy, through these definitions there were attempts of each state to establish a minority citizen's loyalty to the state. So, the determination of such loyalty was exposed to contingent political, social and economic contexts, and it was also dependent on successful negotiations between these minorities and the respective nation state where they migrated. So, partition serves as a template for the reinvention of national histories within India and Pakistan, and yet in the canonical works or the mainstream works written from the nationalist position, the partition is represented as a momentous culmination of anti-colonial national struggle, and so the independence struggle is put on the fore, such that anti-colonial struggle, the struggle for independence, is shown as acceding to the division for the sake of larger adjustments. So, so the anti-colonial national struggle is a way of way of achieving larger achieving a larger Indian unity. It is represented as a necessary compromises acceded by the Indian politicians. So, the canonical works represent partition as a momentous culmination of an anti-colonial national struggle, which agreed to the division for the sake of a larger Indian unity, a kind of compromise that the prominent leaders accepted for securing the sanctity or for securing the kind of stability of national functioning. So, division actually ensured that there would not be prolonged civil wars, continuous civil wars, for example. And so, we see partition represented as a unilinear clear cut movement in most of the mainstream narratives, which enables national self representation of distinct communities. I will stop here today, and we can discuss further in our next lecture. Thank you.